Welcome back to your regularly scheduled program. As you guys know, we got a new intro, courtesy of Not Majesty, or like Majesty VFX. I forget what he calls himself on YouTube. But anyways, I will leave the link to his channel in the description, and of course, shout out to Neptune for also helping with the idea, even though we did have to bash heads a couple of times. So I will leave the link to their channel and their, what do you call it again? Basically, I'm going to leave the link to their story in the description as well. They got a Wattpad account now, and of course they're making their own sort of stories there. So if you guys are interested, go ahead and check it out. Now let's get on to the video. Izuku, well, he was a pretty much average kid, you could say. An average kid in a world full of superpowers. A kid that was bullied for most of his life because of the fact that he had no superpower to call his own. Yeah, a pretty average kid, you could say. Honestly, he was miserable throughout most of his life just because of the fact that he was born with a sort of defect. He was born quirkless. It wasn't something that he could control, and people would pick on him daily for the fact that he was just a defenseless Izuku. Defenseless Izuku, the Deku, another way of saying it. But things would eventually change for Izuku. You see, one night Izuku would notice what looked like a shooting star pass by his window. He would have made a wish. This wish was so that he would one day, just one day, have a quirk to call his own, just so that he would be able to fit in with the rest of the kids. When he made the wish, he would hear something crash nearby. Izuku would have been alarmed, and he would go to investigate. Honestly, a pretty foolish decision looking back at it, but Izuku was young and foolish. He would have ended up finding a crater, and against his bad judgment, Izuku would make an even dumber mistake. He would walk closer to see what was in there. He would see what looked like some weird watch that was inside of the crater. He would have been confused until the watch suddenly latched onto his wrist. Izuku, he would have freaked out trying to get it off of him. It was ineffective though. His mother would have gone downstairs and gone out to the apartment in order to see what was going on. She would have found Izuku outside, and Izuku would just try to explain what just happened. Well, to the best of his ability, at least, when there's literally a crater right next to him. He would just try to play it off as simply him buying a watch at one of the stores they usually passed by. And on top of that, this crater was just something from one of the kids with quirks. You know how kids can be pretty reckless with their quirks from time to time. Inko would have been a bit suspicious, but she would have decided to accept the reason. Izuku now would try to figure out more about this watch, mainly trying to see how he could get rid of it. It didn't even show the time, so he was wondering what kind of watch this was. This watch, instead of showing time, it would be showing these weird silhouettes of different creatures. One of these said creatures, they had 4 arms. He would have accidentally turned it. He didn't know if he had broken it or not because of that. Next thing you know, he wouldn't have seen a new silhouette, this one being of a ghost. He was confused. Did he do something wrong to this watch or something? Oh, well, then again, it did literally just crash and make a whole crater, so Izuku didn't even know for sure. His mother, she would have opened this door unannounced at one point though, while Izuku was trying to experiment with this watch, trying to find out some of its secrets. And she would have accidentally startled Izuku. He would have accidentally slammed onto the watch, and he would have ended up turning into a random alien. A green glow would have been emitted before Inko would encounter a small gray creature in her son's place. Inko, she would have been horrified at first until Izuku, he would try to do his best to calm her down. He would try to explain that, well, there was not necessarily a stranger in her room or anything, in her son's room or anything. No, it was actually him, Izuku. He just turned into this creature after he accidentally pressed down on the watch. He was beginning to think that the watch had some special capabilities of sorts. After all, he was able to transform into this creature, and he remembered seeing some other silhouettes on the face of the watch. He would think of how to get out of the form, and he would try to slam down on the watch again, although now it appeared to be on a different part of his body, more specifically his back. Inko, she would have realized what Izuku was trying to do. When he was trying to feel up his back, she would have just simply picked him up and just press a button on his back in order to get him out to the form, or at least this was the hunch that Inko had. Izuku would transform back to normal afterward. Now this was the start of Izuku's curiosity. Izuku would still get picked on at school, sure, but he would be aware of the fact he had power now. He just needed to learn how to use it. One day during class, the teacher would have made an announcement about everyone wanting to be heroes. Bakugo was rather special in where he would be trying out for UA. Bakugo, he would boast about his superiority because of that. It would be halted though when the teacher mentioned how Izuku also planned on going to UA. The class would have just turned to look at Izuku, but for pretty much all of the class laughed at his face. That was until Bakugo decided to confront Izuku personally. He recommended that Izuku actually drop out. Considering the boy's quirkless status, he would have probably died if he really did try to take the UA entrance exams. He was even worse than the D-lister sidekicks in the making that were in their class. But Izuku's resolve wouldn't be shaken here. In all honesty, Izuku's resolve would have fortified. He would state that he wasn't the weak, defenseless Izuku that Bakugo once knew. He would fiddle with his watch before pressing down on it, hoping to get a desirable alien. After all, he had been training to get a mastery over it ever since that incident with his first transformation. So far, he managed to discover about 4 different aliens. The one Izuku got was, well, 4 arms. Everyone would be shocked seeing this. Bakugo would snarl, exclaiming that just because Izuku got a stupid quirk out of nowhere didn't mean he would ever hold a candle to him. As a matter of fact, Bakugo, he would try to throw an explosion at Izuku, but he would use his extra arms in order to catch Bakugo's arm in mid-air. Bakugo, he would have tried to pull his arm away from Izuku, but the form Izuku took on proved to be rather strong. Unusually strong, actually. Izuku would eventually let go of Bakugo, and from this, Bakugo, he would have been embarrassed, but he would also feel infuriated, feeling as if Izuku had lied about being quirkless all this time. He would question what that watch was for, though. Izuku gravitated towards his latest forms quite a bit, and over the next 10 months, Izuku would use Dagobah Beach as his training grounds. He would have also gotten into the habit of naming his forms as well. The red form with 4 arms he would dub Extra Might. Really creative name, in all honesty. The small gray form he would call Brainiac. He would have named this form that because of, well, the simple fact that it was rather useful in terms of problem solving. It wasn't really all that physically strong like the others, but hey, he would be lying if he said he never used the form to get him through some math homework. This thing was insanely intelligent, actually, now that you really thought about it. It's just that, it's literally just that he couldn't really use that in combat much. Izuku would have found out about a pretty awesome form which was made of what looked like rock, but it was also on fire, and he could shoot fire projections with it too. He would have modeled his fighting style with this form after heroes like Endeavor. In terms of naming it, he would have called it Pyrokinetic. He had a fish form. He guessed that was what mermaids really looked like, and he would name this form Riptide. He didn't find it to be all that useful though, since he usually would get dehydrated very easily. He had a form which basically turned him into a giant bug, and he named it Guasect. Don't judge me for the titles. He had no intention of using this form often though, like at best it was probably for whenever he needed to fly. He had this weird 4-legged form which made him blind, but in exchange for this ability, he found out that this form was incredibly strong and durable. It also had heightened senses as well. He decided to name this form or Omega. He had a ghost form, and it was something he was kind of wary about using in most situations. Maybe he could use it to scare a villain or some. Sure, but when it came on to regular citizens that he was trying to rescue, it was pretty inconvenient. Maybe he could possess some bodies, but Izuku, he wasn't all that interested in doing that. No, he would decide to name this one Grim though. The blue and black lizard Izuku decided to name I Shall Speed. Come on now. I have no regrets about this one. Y'all can roast me in the comments, I don't care. Another form Izuku found capable of projectiles would be one that looked like diamond, in all honesty. It was incredibly durable, never breaking once during his training. Izuku would decide to dub this form Unbreakable. In all honesty, it was probably one of Izuku's favorites already. A green and black form capable of upgrading stuff. They got in contact with Izuku would decide to name it Upgrade. It was a simple but pretty obvious name. On top of that, though, well, it at least served its purpose well. He didn't really care about the unoriginality in this one's name. You know, honestly, Izuku would just shrug. A name is a name at the end of the day. By the end of the 10 months, Izuku, he had become more confident in his abilities. He felt he was ready for the entrance exams. The written exam, Izuku managed to get a B in, and when it came on to the practical exam, Izuku would have gotten excited. He had trained 10 months for this after all. Once the gates had opened up, Izuku would rush in. He would look through his options before selecting pyrokinetic. Everyone would think Izuku had a transformation quirk that allowed him to turn his body into flaming rock. Izuku would obliterate most of the robots within his vicinity, getting several points in the process. Izuku would have managed to collect enough points to make it into the top 5. And of course, Izuku would have been a bit too busy destroying robots in another part of the city simulation to really notice a bomb-cut girl basically struggling to get her leg out of some rubble. She had twisted her ankle and the 0 pointer was approaching her. She was fearing for her life. But the 0 pointer, they would have stopped their movement before they could crush Ochako. Heroes would arrive on the scene to help her out. Right after, Izuku would have been none the wiser. All he was concerned about was whether or not he had passed the entrance exam, since he wasn't really paying attention to how many points he was collecting. He wasn't sure if he had gotten too little, or who knows, maybe he made it into the top 5, maybe he made it into the top 3. He wasn't too sure at the time. In order to relieve his stress, he would be fiddling with his watch in order to just see what else there was to the watch. Try to discover more and more each time. Eventually, he would find out about 2 more forms. These 2 forms consisted of one with yellow armor covering their back, and you would decide to name this one Cannonbolt. The green one with plant-based abilities, he would decide to name this one Poison Ivy. Kind of weird, but he decided it was a pretty effective name. Izuku wouldn't have his stress be relieved though when the letters finally came in and Izuku would find out that he actually did make it into UA. He would have been cheering with his mom the whole night. On the first day of school, at least at UA, Bakugo would already be glaring daggers at Izuku. Izuku would have gulped, but he would have kept moving. The conversation between students would be cut short though by a raggedy looking man who looked like he also hadn't slept in a couple of days, basically introducing himself as Aizawa, and that it had taken them 8 seconds to become quiet. That was highly impractical. Since he was a teacher for the year, the students would have to abide by his rules. And of course, the first thing he would have them do is to suit up in their PE uniforms and go out to the open field. They were apparently supposed to use their quirks throughout this sort of apprehension exam in order for Aizawa to get a gauge for their strengths and weaknesses. One kid would mention how it seemed like fun though. Aizawa, annoyed, would add a bit of a consequence so that the kids would make sure to take the exam seriously. This being that whoever was in last place, they would be expelled. The class would try to argue about how unfair it was, but Aizawa, he would hear none of it. Now I'm gonna be honest. For the sake of convenience, we're just going to be using the original alien name since that's what literally everybody else knows these aliens by. So, yeah. Izuku would decide to go with Accelerate for the 50-meter dash. He would have gotten an even higher score than Ida, which would surprise everybody there. Tests like the grip strength and ball throw test he would use forearms for, considering the incredible pure strength this beast had. Izuku, he would have managed to reach the top 5 thanks to multiple abilities and forms that he would take on. Many would be curious as to what Izuku's quirk was and what was up with that watch of his. They were curious to find out if it was just for effect or did it have some sort of relation to his quirk, whatever that quirk was, that is. Even Aizawa would be interested in this kid. He even tried erasing his quirk at one point during a ball throw, but Izuku didn't de-transform at all. That made no sense to Aizawa. He would need to investigate more into the situation. Mineta, he would have been expelled, shocking many of the students. Even Momo was surprised, in all honesty. She believed that it would have just been one of those ruses that teachers would pull in order to get the best performance out of their classes, but she was apparently wrong. Aizawa would mention how Mineta hadn't shown anything all that impressive throughout the apprehension exam. Mineta would have been distraught over this, but the next week Mineta would have been re-enrolled into UA. Mineta was given a second chance by Aizawa, and if he did well during class today, he would get to stay in the class. While communicating about what sort of class assignment they'd have, a larger-than-life figure, they would have ended up opening up the door. Everyone would just be awe-inspired seeing All Might in the flesh. Some would even have goosebumps seeing the man. The students, they would be doing practical combat via a hero versus villains simulation. They'd be in pairs of 2, with one group being villains and the other, they would be heroes. Izuku would find himself on a team with Ochako Uraraka. He would have seen her costume and blushed, turning around to hide it. Izuku would have been wearing a dark green and black jumpsuit with some armor around it. He noticed that most of the forms he took in would either they would just take his clothes he wore at the time and alter them to fit with the theme of the form, or simply not even have his clothes appear at all. An example for the latter would of course be whenever he became Heat Blast, but the form whenever he did transform back, despite not showing any clothes in forms like Heat Blast or anything, Izuku would have found himself still having his regular clothes afterwards. Something really convenient, to be honest. So Izuku wouldn't be all that concerned about the clothing department. Izuku would have found out he was facing up against Bakugo and Ida, who were villains in this exam. He would try turning into Heat Blast for this exam in order to beat fire with fire, but he would get Wild Mutt instead. Ochako would question what this form was, since Izuku hadn't shown it in the apprehension exam on the first day. But Izuku would be incapable of communication in this form. He'd have to take what he had, he supposed. Izuku would do his best to communicate with Ochako for her to get on top of his back, and of course when she got the memo, the two, they would charge into battle. Izuku's heightened senses, they would allow him to dodge an explosion from Bakugo. Bakugo, he would try to figure that this was another one of Izuku's forms, and he would try to attack the boy again. Izuku would dodge once more, attempting to pounce on a blonde. Bakugo, he would fire off a second explosion while Izuku was in the air. This time around, Izuku wasn't able to maneuver his way out of this fireball. Not even fireball, just explosion. And so Izuku would end up hitting the wall. Ochako, she would have hit her head and she would have fallen unconscious. Bakugo would comment on how pathetic Izuku was. He was so weak that he was incapable of even protecting his teammate in this competition. Izuku, he well just been riled up though. He refused to just go back to how he originally was. Back then, Izuku had no power. He was weak. He was unable to defend himself, but now was a completely different situation. He had power for once in his life, and he wasn't about to just take a step backwards. No, Izuku would decide to charge forward. He would have acted more barbaric in his current fighting style. Izuku would go for the legs, throwing Bakugo off balance. Bakugo would try to punch Izuku off of him, but Izuku would just bite Bakugo's leg, breaking it. Bakugo, he would roar in pain before deciding to take it up a notch against Izuku. He would pull the pin on one of his gauntlets, explaining that a special property to his gauntlets is that they store up his sweat. That meant he could create even larger explosions than normally. All Might would hear this, and he was trying to communicate over the intercom, telling Bakugo not to use that gauntlet, do not use that attack. Bakugo's judgment would have been clouded though with his desire to win and to put Izuku in his place. Izuku would have been sent flying from the explosion. He would have hit the wall on the other side of the room with enough force to crack it. Izuku would have changed back to his normal form, unconscious. The villains won the assignment, but Bakugo would have received a stern lecture from All Might. He could have killed Izuku if he were in a more delicate form. Bakugo, he didn't really care though. He didn't want to hear any of what his idol had to say right now. He would just be taken by Ida to the clinic as well as Izuku and Ochako. Bakugo, of course, for the broken leg, Izuku and Ochako for the fact that they were unconscious and they were literally slammed into walls earlier. When it came on to Bakugo, he would just be reflecting on the fight. He wasn't expecting for Izuku to be so strong, enough to actually injure him to such an extent. Bakugo didn't really count this as a win in his book because of that fact. It made zero sense to Bakugo how strong the green-haired nerd managed to become in order for him to accomplish such a feat. They wouldn't be able to witness Todoroki's performance though during his combat simulation where he froze an entire building. Bakugo, he would have been in an even more sour mood if he actually witnessed Todoroki's performance. Todoroki would have been declared class president the next day, but he would give it up to Momo. He literally had no interest in the role after all. Ida would have become vice president as a result. Izuku would have been happy for Ida, but he would appear to be a bit spaced out even while on their way to USJ for a specific exercise that they couldn't simply do at school. He'd be thinking back to his match against Bakugo, and he would question why he got the wrong transformation. Not only that, but why couldn't he be Bakugo back there? Was he still too weak? He thought for sure he'd be strong enough to contend against the blonde by now. Izuku would have been launched out of his mind space though when Asuyu tapped his shoulder. He would jolt up in shock and look around before focusing his attention on Suyu. He'd be questioned on what sort of quirk he had. From the seams of it, he had the transformation quirk, but the amount of different forms Izuku had were ridiculous. It seemed like he had a form to match every single situation. Izuku would just rub the back of his head though, laughing nervously. He'd explained that wasn't necessarily the case. He had 12 forms currently, sure, but he wouldn't necessarily say that they matched every situation. There were about 12 forms, and each form was unique in its own way, and he had to figure out ways to use them in every sort of situation. It wasn't that they necessarily were great for any situation or anything. It's literally just that he had variety on his side. This would just amaze many other people. It really seemed like Izuku could become a top tier hero if his other forms were as strong and diverse as the ones he had shown so far. Izuku wasn't used to praise, so he didn't know how to really react. Bakugo, he would have been hearing the conversation though, and he would let off a low growl, showing his displeasure and the treatment that Izuku was getting now. By the time they made it to the USJ, they would meet up with the Space Hero 13. They'd be explaining the dangerous aspects of their quirks and how to properly manage them when a portal suddenly opened up. Hiroshima would point it out, thinking the school brought in fake villains for their assignment. But Aizawa would realize right at that moment that these were real villains. He would tell the students to get back. Izuku would have gone through his transformations though, and he would decide to go with Diamond Head, or well, Unbreakable. The students, they would look at this form in awe. It seems so cool. It looks so shiny. Izuku would state that he called this form Unbreakable. It sounded like a bit of a cocky name, but the students would find out the reason for the name not too long later. Izuku would have shot projectiles at multiple villains, pinning them down. Izuku would have charged at the other villains that he missed, and he would knock out quite a few with ease. Some would try to sneak up behind him, but failed to subdue him. Shigaraki would have been annoyed seeing how easily his army of villains were getting taken down by just a couple of heroes and students. There was something that intrigued Shigaraki though. That of course being the emblem on Izuku's chest. His master, he had mentioned it a couple of times before. Apparently there was something special about it. He wanted it. He would order the Nomu to deal with the Crystal Man. The Nomu was a giant hulking creature. Its skin was dark red with cybernetic eyes. Their appearance, it was unsettling to Izuku. The boy would fight his hardest against the Nomu, managing to do some damage to the creature, but they would manage to heal up from said damage. Izuku would have been doing his best in order to compete against the creature, but it had abilities that just nullified Izuku's efforts against them every single time. Ida would have left to alert the other teachers back at UA of the situation. Izuku would have been holding down the fort against the Nomu. He would have refused to back down since he didn't really have much of a choice in the matter. 15 minutes would have passed, and Izuku was beginning to tire out. He would still continue in his fight against the Nomu though. He was amazed at how he hadn't timed out yet. Izuku would attempt to cover the Nomu in a layer of crystal-like material to hold him in place. He wasn't sure how long it would last though. It would have taken a couple minutes for the Nomu to break out though. At this point, Izuku would have been incapable of fending off against the Nomu on his own. Other students, they would begin to go help Izuku once they had dealt with their own sets of villains. Todoroki, he would have frozen half out of the Nomu's body, only for it to rip off that part and regrow their lost limbs. Bakugo, he would have shot several explosions at the Nomu, but it would have little to no effect on the creature. He would use one of his gauntlets, throwing the Nomu back though. Even then, that still wasn't enough to hold the creature down for long. Izuku, he wouldn't be able to even help anymore because right at that moment, as soon as Bakugo and Todoroki jumped in, he would have reverted back to his normal form, tired from the fight, and his body was aching. At this moment, All Might would have arrived at the scene and fended off against the Nomu from there. The #1 hero would have had a heartfelt match against the abomination of science, but he would eventually win out in the end with the help of the Nomu having been worn down prior to the fight. More heroes would arrive on the scene, dealing with any other villains within the vicinity. Shigaraki and Kirigiri, they would have recognized that this was basically a lost match, and they would escape, leaving the Nomu behind. The Nomu would be taken into custody alongside the rest of the remaining villains. Shigaraki would be irritated at his loss back at the USJ. He would mention the loss even to his master, All For One, mentioning how they cheated. There was a child who turned into a crystal-like being that was capable of withstanding blows from the Nomu. All For One would question if there was any strange symbol anywhere on his body. Shigaraki, he would mention the sort of green hourglass symbol the kid had on his chest though, and he would even mention how he saw them power down too after his classmates decided to join the fray. All For One would grin hearing this. He would have been recording his conversation with his puppet once man-child mentioned there being a crystal-like being. He would have sent it off to another person, another being, whatever you want to call them, an associate or business partner, someone could say. The power of the Omnitrix, it would soon be theirs. And yeah, that's basically what part 1 is for right now, people. Sorry if you guys hear like any background noise, cause I'm guessing there's like a basketball or football game going on right now, and yeah, I don't think I need to get into much detail. You guys already know like the whole thing with family and sports. So yeah, it is your boy Kuntai Next signing out. You guys already know the deal. If you like the video, if you like my content in general, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and if you guys know any more people who are interested in this sort of content, please share the video. So yeah, I'm out.